So other architects who came to Texas at roughly that same time period and were accustomed to working in a vernacular somewhere else, in Harwell's case, California, where redwood was the given material. A year or two in Texas, and the first thing you discover is that redwood doesn't hold up in Texas in the weather, the extremes of the weather. So the material palette that you might have been used to, or if Howard cared for the work of Marcel Breuer, let's say, in New England, bringing that material palette to Texas is a suspect kind of thing. And so it does absolutely show in his work that he began to watch the work of David Williams and O'Neill Ford, his predecessors here, who were almost obsessed with finding a Texas vernacular and had gone south to Fredericksburg, on down to Castroville, to Roma, to the border, to look at early Spanish work and see the soft Mexican bricks and the various materials that had been brought by the Spanish up the Camino Real into Texas. And so Howard was clear in saying in audio tapes and other interviews that he was influenced by that work. And you'll see it was not an accident that when he brought William Worcester into the Temple Emmanuel project, that one of the early design conversations was to drive Worcester around and show him O'Neill Ford's work in that same Mexican brick. And that brick winds up being the material palette, along with the poured-in-place concrete of Ford's work as part of Temple Emmanuel. It's almost a sad commentary, I guess, in a way, about architectural education at the moment, pedagogy at the moment, that all these things that Howard cared about, that the things he was best at, are only now being able to make sort of a reappearance in the architectural discussions around the world. At the time, you know, and we make jokes of it in Texas that bigger is better. But when you look at the dark side of that quantity in some way is supposed to be quality, I think that there's a real issue to be talked about. So in Howard's case, while he did do large buildings, his legacy, I think, is really focused on the smaller, careful, thoughtful work that I mean, anyone that knows architecture, and any architect would tell you that houses are every bit as difficult, if not more difficult, than a large project. And they're usually used for test cases for ideas, just because in a certain way they happen quicker than the larger projects do, and you can be faster on your feet with trying out ideas. But I think that's where the beauty of Howard's architectural work resides, is in those very small details which for a time period, and especially in Texas, weren't perhaps considered all that important. And now when the primary architectural theorists in the world right now, Juhani Plasma and those kinds of people, writers in England even, are writing about the materiality of things and experiential sorts of things that relate to fine finishes on materials, things, the way that they feel when you put your hand around a doorknob, and the smell of a space when you walk into it, that's where the significance has always been in architecture, and Howard knew it, and his work reflects it, even if he wasn't very articulate talking about it. He was not there's some architects that are really good about talking, and then there's some that just aren't. They have the capacity to do the work, they're just not very good at speaking about it. And so I think it would be fair to say of Howard that he wasn't that articulate verbally about talking about his own work, or even really saying what it was that he thought he was doing. But nonetheless, it's in the work, and that's the test. That's the bottom line, really, to me. That idea of being the first modernist in Dallas, or at least the most visible of the first like that, is, there's no question it's an important thing. It sort of goes back to what I was saying about the classification of things and styles and so on, is that at that point in the 20th century, in the 30s, 40s, let's say, you could still say something like that. You could still say modernism entered Texas, and you could even, up till recently, you could fairly well track something like that. You used, just like in art history, you used a specific evidence of this house showed that, this house showed that, and you followed the movement of it through history in some way. I don't know if that's possible anymore. I think we've gotten to a point, whether it's the computer, whether technology had a huge role in it or not, where not just putting things in categories and naming styles and so on, but that ideas move so fast in our culture, in the world, that I'm not sure we're at a point where you can say anything, entered anything anymore. Just the possibility of me getting on the internet and seeing something as a work done in Denmark or some funny corner somewhere, it just becomes, the grain of the conversation in some way becomes so fine that I'm not sure there's a way to do that anymore, to track an idea through time. And so I think Howard sort of sits right at the last of that, maybe in a way where you could even say that. Yes, it was hard. Yes, there's other, there's Bud Oglesby, Inslee Oglesby. There's other architects in Dallas who were on the modern trail, as it were, and who brought to Dallas a kind of dialogue, a kind of discourse about modernism and about architecture of a certain quality, the quality thing again, that is really exceptional and rare. I know it's one reason that I spend a lot of time in Dallas is that my peers here have Frank Welch would say it's a collegial kind of conversation about modernism, which is really not the norm for professionals talking to each other about things. The competitive aspect takes over, and in Dallas there's a much better feel for what everyone's trying to accomplish out of that. There's almost a kind of a group esprit de corps that's moving through that you won't find in other places, and I attribute the beginnings of that to Howard and to his someone has to take that first beating. And I think Howard paid the price. In Fort Worth, it was Emory Young. There's a number of people who, by virtue of sort of putting the first white boxes or the first glass box into a particular location, are going to pay that price. And he paid it. He, with a stiff upper lip, he did the work and put it out there. And his is softer in a way. It could be more elegant because his clients were those kinds of clients. If he wanted to use teak for interior siding, these were the people that could do that. I think for students now, it wouldn't be as much, I'm not even sure that they would relate to the idea of a style moving through a place the way that we usually talk about it. But I think that working from conviction and trying to hold to a certain set of precepts at a certain time and place is all that there ever was to architecture, is to have a sensibility in some way, and that's if you could fill the room with 12 of the best architects in the world and skip over all the circumstantial things and all of the what are you working on right now sort of conversation and get to the real meat of it, I think that that's what basically everybody would be on the same page about, is that to be an architect is to have a certain sensibility that you've refined over time and through experience, that you can bring to the work, that you can bring to problem solving. And the building, in effect, is just the artifact that's left over from that set of values being brought to the problem. It reflects all those things, but you don't start out at the beginning with what I think is kind of the general public perception that you start with what it looks like, and sort of find a way to make it look like that. And the opposite, I think, is actually the case, is that you start with a certain idea about things philosophically, you work with the problem at hand, and what it looks like is the last thing. It's in the Beaux-Arts tradition, and this is very telling about that. When you drew a set of working drawings for a building, you started with the details and worked out from the details. And the very last drawings that you did in a set of working drawings were the elevations, were the part that what it actually looked like. And the general public, I think, would perceive the opposite, or even students today working on the computer, for example, start with the opposite. They start with what it looks like and then try to make the details give them that appearance when they're finished. And it's I think, to Howard's sense, I think that would have been inside out. I think it would have been sort of working backwards through the tunnel. And So I think that he could bring that to a current sensibility, the concern for detail, and that things come from that and not towards it. That his furniture designing and making, aside from being a Bauhaus idea, bring that level of craft back into the conversation again. That architecture's wandered off for several decades looking at literature and looking at philosophy and looking at other disciplines in a way that it makes you think that it just sort of lost its ground for a while. And I think the answer's always been right there in front. It is in the making of a thing, and a place for human beings to live. In one respect, those qualities never change, and they're timeless. Carolyn Clark had brought the original film to the Dallas Architectural Foundation. I have a privilege, I guess, in a way that at least had never happened before, that my architectural friends are mostly in Dallas, and so my wife, who's also an architect, my wife and I spend a lot of time here in conversations with architects about things that are hard to find conversations about around the state. And as a funny side effect of that, I've been invited to participate in a number of different Dallas organizations as well. So I've been president of the Dallas Architectural Foundation, and I sit on the board now of the Dallas Architecture Forum, in charge of panels and symposia and trying to keep that conversation about architecture alive. And Carolyn Clark I know also through other reasons, through the Nakoma House, through the house here at Rockbrook, and her family situation along the way. So she had brought the film to our attention at the Dallas Architectural Foundation probably around 2000, and I immediately offered to help in whatever way that I was capable of helping with the film. The foundation was anxious to be part of that in some way, but basically it sat on a shelf for almost a decade. And then Carolyn had called last year to talk about trying to bring it back to something that she'd be happy with. And so it's been a privilege to be able to work on all this in that way, and to come to know Howard even better than my own concerns had immediately sort of taken me through his work. It would be impossible to have a conversation with any architect in Dallas for more than about half an hour before Howard's name comes up anyway. So he is sort of the benchmark for all that, whether stylistically or, again, I go back to quality of things. There's a very interesting precedent in Dallas for the issue of quality, and I think it has played out in architecture and over the years. There's a constant kind of upping of the ante here in a healthy but deliberate kind of way. In the architecture of north central Texas, but really especially Dallas, you just almost can't talk about Dallas architecture without having talked about Howard at some point. And what I know Carolyn would hope is that ripple will spread out to larger, my friends, architectural historians around the state and around southwestern United States, all obviously know about Howard Meyer's work, but we would hope that this would be work that would be seen now by an even larger audience over time, especially since those things we were talking about, the quality of the more tactile issues, the textural issues, all the five senses being now again sort of back in play conceptually in architecture. Not like they ever went anywhere, but somehow academically they did for a while. Especially now that all those things are back at the forefront, Howard's work speaks to all that really clearly. Well, I stand clearly with Donald Judd on this, is that thought and feeling are they're just complementary aspects of something. They're not two different things, and that you can't take them apart. You can't say, in college I invented the word poetechnical because I'm always trying to reconcile art and science.